Lisa Benson, Vice President for Communications and Strategy at the Brennan Center for Justice. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. First, we will leave time for questions at the end of this discussion. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to add them via YouTube and Facebook chat. Second, civility is important to all of us at Brennan Center. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. Lastly, we provide live closed captioning. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School and Senior Visiting Research Scholar at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, Genevieve Lakier.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Genevieve.
So we live in an era characterized by pervasive anxiety about the problem of lies and misinformation. President Obama famously asserted a few years ago that the problem of lies and misinformation had brought about what he called an epistemic crisis, in which members of our political community simply could not agree about the basic facts of our political and social world, and therefore could not effectively engage in the process of democratic self-government together. Now, President Obama is not the only one by any means who has made the argument that the United States is facing right now an epistemic crisis brought on by the pervasiveness of lies and misinformation in the public sphere. And this epistemic crisis appeared to become dramatically visible on January 6th of last year, when supporters of President Trump, spurred on by the false claims that Trump and many of his confederates and supporters had made about fraud in the presidential election, invaded the Capitol building in an effort to disrupt the transfer of power to Joe Biden. Sadly enough, although the effort to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power failed ultimately, the crisis has not lessened in the intervening 14 months. Significant portions of the American electorate continue to believe that there was significant fraud in the 2020 election, even though there is no evidence to back that up. And lies and misinformation continue to circulate widely in our media environment. And I should note, it's not just the voters who continue to believe or recycle lies. Elected officials continue to raise these kinds of doubts about the legitimacy of the 2020 election all the time. Now, of course, these lies are only a subset of the politically salient, powerful lies that appear in public discourse all the time. But they raise, in a particularly acute form, a number of pressing questions. First, what is responsible for the epistemic crisis that the United States is now facing? And second, maybe most important of all, what is there that we can do about it? Rick Hasen, Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine, just published a new book entitled Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It, that suggests answers to these burning questions. So over the next hour, we are going to talk about the arguments, the answers this book provides, and how to regulate lies and misinformation in such a way as to protect and not impair American democracy. Hi, Rick. It's so nice to see you.
Oh, it's so great to be with you. I'm really excited about our conversation.
Okay, so I thought I would kick off the conversation by starting with the basics. So in your new book, you argue that many of the problems with the state of American democracy, including particularly the problem of lies and disinformation and misinformation, can be traced to the rise of what you call cheap speech. Now, as you note in the book, the phrase cheap speech was coined by Professor Eugene Volokh in I think it was a 1995 Law Review article. But in that article, Professor Volokh came to a very different conclusion than you do about the impact that cheap speech would have on American democracy, politics, and culture. So can you just first define what is cheap speech and then explain why it is such a problem, and in particular, its connection to this epistemic crisis I talked about earlier?
Sure. And of course, I had the advantage of writing about cheap speech after the technological revolution. Professor Volokh was writing in 1995, just as it was beginning. And it was actually quite a prescient piece, predicting the rise of things like Spotify and Netflix, and the idea that we literally can have the knowledge of the world in the palm of our hands through our smartphones. And he saw that we were going to move from an environment in which information was scarce, when there were only a limited number of television channels because of the broadcast spectrum being limited and a few newspapers, to a flood of information. And he recognized that this new technological revolution was going to undermine intermediaries like newspapers that helped people figure out what the truth is in the world right now. But his take, as you said, was quite optimistic. He believed that voters and others would be able to get the kind of information they need to be able to make intelligent choices without these intermediaries. And so he meant cheap speech in the sense that information would be inexpensive to produce and disseminate. And it is inexpensive to produce and disseminate some information. But it turns out that producing quality information that voters rely on most, things like investigative reports by news organizations, that's really expensive to produce. The rise of cheap speech has undermined the economic model for these newspapers. First, there was Craigslist, and that undermined the economic model for classified advertising that supported newspapers, and then other advertising shifted to the point now where much advertising appears on social media sites like Facebook or on search engines like Google. And so the economic model of newspapers has collapsed. The ease with which someone can create a website that looks as good as an actual newspaper's website, those costs have gone way down. And not only is misinformation easily produced, there's a ready market for it for reasons that we can talk about. And so I mean cheap speech in the second sense that lower valued information has an advantage in this market. And the loss of intermediaries has taken away from voters a very valuable tool that they use to separate out what's true from what's false. And so the book Cheap Speech is asking how that impacts our democracy and the legitimacy of our elections and the ability of voters to make choices and what we can do about that.
Okay, great. I guess I want to push a little bit more because, so as you know, I've written a bit about the history of media regulation in the country going back the last 200 years. And there is a way in which one could narrate the entire history of the sort of media change in the US as an increasing development towards increasingly cheap speech. So we go from a period in the 18th century where the post office is the primary disseminator of information, and it's extremely, the parcel post, it's very expensive to transmit information, so expensive that Congress thinks they have to subsidize the newspapers, which it does quite effectively, to the telegram, which makes the dissemination of information much cheaper and is greeted by similar kinds of, I think, initially euphoric claims about its democracy enhancing potential, and then similar concerns about its corrosive effects. And then we have the telephone, we have the television, we have movies, we have all of these technological developments that increasingly lower the cost of disseminating information. But in the book, you suggest that there's something qualitatively different about the recent technological advances. And I guess I want to understand more a little bit why it is that there has been this qualitative change. Is it a product of technological change or something else?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. First of all, we're in a very polarized period in American society. And so anytime someone can take advantage of technology for political purposes, they're going to try and do so because we have these very hard-fought elections under these very extreme conditions right now, conditions which didn't exist a few decades ago. But I should say when I first started writing Cheap Speech, I wrote a chapter that was a law review article back in 2017. I became increasingly concerned about the potential for violence in our electoral process. And I had to rewrite the entire first draft of Cheap Speech after January 6th, 2021, when we had the insurrection. And so this is an example of, I think, the velocity and virality of the way that false information can spread now is qualitatively different than the kind of jumps that we had in the past, even the jumps from radio to television. And so to take a very specific example, Donald Trump between November 3rd, 2020 and November 21st, 2020, so in a 19-day period after the election where he refused to concede, he over 400 times made false claims on Twitter that the election was being stolen, that it was rigged, that something had to be done about it. He was able to make these claims incessantly, and they were spread by his supporters far and wide. Just imagine if we had the polarization of today, but the technology of the 1950s. Of course, the TV stations and the local newspapers and the few national newspapers would have reported what he did, what he said, but they wouldn't have reported it 400 times, and they would have put it in context, like there's no evidence to support these kind of claims. he now had the ability to make unmediated contact with voters. And then the second part of this, those voters who believed his claims could organize themselves together as they did using Facebook groups in a way that they couldn't have organized before, and actually organized for some of them for violent political action that led to the insurrection in the Capitol. And so that, I think, the technology coupled with the polarization, coupled with the demagoguery of someone like Trump, created the kind of conditions that we got on January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, that's undoubtedly true. But again, I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical that this is so uniquely new. Because I was thinking about your discussion about Trump and how if we had gone back a few decades, this wouldn't have been possible. And immediately I thought about an earlier demagogue, American demagogue, Joe McCarthy. Now, Joe McCarthy rose to power in a period when the technological environment looked very different, where there were very strong gatekeepers in the 1950s, which we think of as, in many ways as the high point of this sort of what many people look nostalgically back on as a kind of a well-regulated media infrastructure. But all the evidence suggests is that the newspapers really contributed to Joe McCarthy's rise. Perhaps he couldn't directly speak to the people in as unmediated a fashion as Trump, but because newspapers, just like social media platforms, are organized around a profit logic, they want to make money. And Joe McCarthy sold a lot of editions of newspapers. Newspapers carried what he did in his speeches every day. And so what do we think about that? What do you think about the Joe McCarthy example? I mean, how new is the sort of the problem of Trump? And I guess I'll ask a second question. Law professors always love multi-part questions, so forgive me, but in your earlier argument, in your earlier answer to the question of cheap speech, you suggested that the real problem is the loss of gatekeepers. But even today, we can see that Fox News or One America or other non-social media platforms disseminate a lot of Trump supportive rumors, demagoguery, and lies. And so you might think that they're acting in the same way that newspapers in the McCarthy era were acting to prop up and reinforce the power of a demagogue. And so how unique is the January's, Trump and his followers? And how much is it about the problems of social media or something else?
Right. Well, let me start with the second part first, because I think that although the topic of this Brennan Center event is focused on social media, I'm talking about the broader media environment, which includes the media environment of multiple cable news networks that don't have, that don't have the same journalistic ethics as we had seen in the past, and are willing to pander for both political reasons as well as for profit motives. And I think we need to come back to this question about who's profiting from the spread of disinformation, because it turns out a lot of people are getting rich on this, and they're building more demand. So I don't mean to confine my argument, and I don't in the cheap speech book confine my argument to social media. I think that if you look at, for example, the work of Yochai Benkler and others at Harvard, it's pretty clear that social media is just part of the media environment, and that something like Fox News plays a very large role in both fomenting polarization, and I think in the context of something like the 2020 election, providing a means for spreading false information about election integrity. On your broader point about McCarthy, I think there are a couple of points to make. Number one is even though newspapers sure were hyping what McCarthy was doing in the same way that CNN or CBS or others would follow Trump because and show his rallies because they were so outrageous and they got eyeballs. What we have now is the ability to have unmediated access, and so that allows not only for the candidate or the politician to be able to spread the messages, but then it allows for organization of political activity that goes beyond what people are just typing on their screens to actually invading the Capitol. And so I think that a big part of what's different here is the peer-to-peer kind of connections that weren't possible in the 1950s, and that can build upon it. So if you look at some of the January 6th, and I quote some of these in the cheap speech book, if you look at some of the people who actually engaged in violent actions on January 6th, they're quoting Donald Trump's tweets about he said, come, it will be wild. We will have a wild time. Let's go and let's listen to him, and let's go and take back our country. So I think that is a very big difference from the situation in the past.
Okay, so what you're describing is in some ways the dark side of the same thing that Professor Volokh described in his earlier law review article, because all of these phenomena were in many ways predicted, but they were predicted as a wonderful thing, as democratization. Look at the people taking back the ability to make choices. What you just described is from a First Amendment perspective, a robust freedom of association, participatory democracy, the ability of people to not simply be passive consumers of the news. One of the big critiques of the 1950s and 1960s media ecosystem is it made people too passive to a really active uptake of the news. And so I guess from a free speech perspective, I'm curious how we draw the line, or how we distinguish between the pernicious or pathological exercise of this new democratic capacity that you're talking about, the ability for the people themselves to peer-to-peer associate, advance, act on the basis of, and also participate in the public sphere in a way that was not perhaps possible earlier. So there's, the bad uses, but then there's also, of course, all the wonderful uses, the activism, the movement for Black lives, the, kids in Iowa who want to meet peers who have similar interest in, miniature trains, and all of a sudden can do so. All of these wonderful uses of social media. How do we distinguish between the good and the bad?
I think that's an excellent question, and I do try and address this in Cheap Speech. I think there are many, I think I specifically talked about this in a op-ed that I had in the New York Times in connection with the release of my book a few weeks ago. Certainly, the ability, for example, to post videos taken on cell phones of police brutality helped to galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement and movements towards greater racial justice. There are many positive sides of this cheap speech. The fact that we can get information from a variety of sources, that we don't have to rely if we want to do our own investigation. So these are all positive things. And so what I can say is that because there are positive aspects and negative aspects of this new media environment, I don't think that the solution to dealing with our problems is censorship. I don't think it's passing laws, except for in some very narrow contexts that I talk about, such as empirically verifiable false claims about when, where, and how people vote. I generally don't support laws that would squelch speech. Instead, I want to provide voters with better information so that they can make choices that are consistent with their preferences and their interests. Because it is becoming harder and harder to figure out what's true and what's false, I think we need to think about constructing laws that provide voters with the tools they need to be able, and I'm focused on the election context, to be able to figure out if our elections are being run fairly and what information they need in order to decide who to vote for.
Okay, great. I mean, I think what's fascinating about the book is that it has two prongs of solutions, one aimed at regulators, one aimed at private companies themselves. So I don't want to forget about the private company part, but let's focus on the laws. So so what are the kinds of laws you recommend being enacted to help voters get better information? So
let me I have a long list in the book, but let me give a couple of examples. So one thing that we're facing today is technology is making it easier to create videos that could make it appear that a politician is saying or doing something that she's not. Could be a politician being shown in a sexually compromised position, or saying a racial epithet, or having a heart attack. These are so-called deepfakes. And the fact that these videos are going to be more easily produced as technology improves raises real problems for voters being able to figure out, what can I believe what I'm seeing? And this creates two kinds of problems. One, some voters might be taken in by the false information. And two, and I think this is probably the larger problem, people are going to discount all information they see, even truthful information, because they can't tell what's true from what's false, and so they figure everything's false. A kind of market for lemons problem that I talk about in the book, reminiscent of a famous economics article about the used car market. So how do you deal with these kind of things? And it's even worse than this, because we see what Professors Chesney and Citron call the liar's dividend. someone might claim that something that's true about them is actually false. And just a couple of weeks ago, Roger Stone, the Donald Trump ally, was filmed for a documentary saying a bunch of things about the January 6th insurrection that he now claimed were simply deepfakes. They weren't really true. And so really kind of mucking up the waters. It's when Trump, anytime he saw bad news, would call it fake news. And so, so how can we deal with this problem? And so one thing that I suggest is that anytime there are certain videos that are posted that meet certain criteria to be considered altered, to be considered deepfakes, they would have to be labeled as altered. And so when a voter sees this video, they would recognize they were looking at an altered video. It would apply whether someone's doing it for satire, whether they're doing it for political purposes, whether they're doing it for any purpose. And so this kind of information, I think, should be helpful to voters to be able to distinguish what's true from what's not true. Now, there are all kinds of technical questions about whether you can actually identify these deepfakes, and I deal with that. But assuming you can, I think a labeling requirement gives voters more information and can help them distinguish between disinformation and truth.
Although in the book, you also talk about the problems with labels, that there's some evidence that labels can have perverse effects, that earlier in the last election, when information was labeled as false or questioned, it was correlated with increasing circulation. Do you worry about that at all with the disclosure requirement of deepfakes?
Right. So the details matter a lot here. So Twitter tended to label some of Donald Trump's tweets by saying this claim about the election is disputed, which doesn't really say it's false. And Facebook did much worse. Facebook has something that said, learn more about our elections, visit usa.gov, which to me seemed to imply that they were actually endorsing the false claims. I think those kind of problems don't arise with the word altered. And I prefer the word altered to a word that would be more pejorative. Altered just means this is different from the original. You're not saying this is manipulated video or something with some kind of negative connotation. I think that could work to provide voters with information. Similarly, I think we need to improve our campaign finance disclosure laws. We had a situation in 2016 where Russian government operatives posed as Black voters and tried to convince Black voters in the United States to stay home and not vote for Hillary Clinton because she had not done enough for the African-American community. I think if voters knew that the people sending these messages were coming from St. Petersburg in a boiler room rather than coming from fellow voters in the United States, they might have looked at those messages differently. Similar situation, we had those people on the left supporting Doug Jones, who was running in a special U.S. Senate election in 2017 to replace Jeff Sessions against Roy Moore. You had some people on the left posing as Baptist teetotalers who were saying, vote for Roy Moore. He will help to get rid of alcohol in the state of Alabama. And this was a deliberate effort, we know from some leaked papers, to try to suppress the votes of moderate Republicans who would be turned off to Roy Moore if he were associated with that. Well, I think that those moderate Republicans, if they knew that these messages were not coming from Baptist teetotalers, but were instead coming from people who supported the Democrat in the race, that would help them to evaluate this information and whether or not it was something that should be relied upon.
And so the rule would be, if you're going to pay money to support a candidate, you have to disclose your true information, your true identity.
Well, so we already have rules that require this outside the social media context. So if I want to run an advertisement in a newspaper saying vote for Donald Trump or something like that, I have to disclose my identity. And there have been some loopholes that Congress needs to fix, but the system worked pretty well for a while. And same thing, if I want to run a TV ad that says Joe Biden is a true leader, I've got to disclose my identity. And then you can go and find some reports from the Federal Election Commission and figure out, who's behind a group that is running an advertisement. And then that can be promoted. Today, we have so many gaps in our laws that if that advertisement comes through your TV, through Hulu or YouTube TV, it's not subject to the same regulation as if it comes through your cable box or from a satellite provider. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think anyone who spends a significant enough amount of money trying to influence how voters are going to vote in an election should have to have their identities disclosed, unless, as the Supreme Court has long recognized, they can show that they would face a legitimate risk of being harassed for their views.
And what about people who don't spend a significant amount of money? We might imagine that there's a lot of...
Yes, I would worry about them less. I think we really are looking for the larger scale operations, at least within the context of US citizens. I think we can have a much lower bar for foreign spending. The Supreme Court unanimously held in a case called Blumen versus Federal Election Commission that foreign spending in US elections can be barred, consistent with the First Amendment. So I think we can have a different standard there. But for US citizens, I don't want to go after the small potatoes, grassroots people. I'm not looking to require the person who gives $100 to a candidate who's controversial for all of their neighbors to know. I don't think there's a big social interest in that. But I think someone who's spending a significant amount of money to try to influence opinions in elections should have to disclose their identity. Now, both of these things that I've suggested, which is both improved disclosure laws on social media sites, as well as labeling altered deepfakes as altered, is something that in the past, I think the Supreme Court could well have accepted. But today we have some changes in the court. And I think that these laws would face an uncertain future if they were passed by Congress before this Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to ask, how do we think about this area of regulation given an increasingly deregulatory First Amendment? Yeah.
Yes. Well, so, there's two things to say about that. First, I am worried about this, the Supreme Court continuing, and I think Justice Kennedy probably said it most clearly in cases like thinking of Packingham. He had a kind of very optimistic view, very much like Volokh, about how the internet was going to free us all, and things were going to be very positive. But Justice Kennedy was also a huge supporter of campaign finance disclosure laws, as was Justice Scalia. There were many conservatives on the court in the past who were very much in favor of disclosure. But today it seems that some of the justices embrace much more of Justice Thomas's position of a kind of marketplace of ideas approach, where not only can you say what you want and spend what you want on elections, you can do so without any accountability and with full anonymity. Justice Scalia was famous for saying this doesn't represent the home of the brave. And so I do worry that either the compelled speech doctrine or the rules about anonymity, as we saw most recently in the Bonta case from the Supreme Court's last term, does make me worry that many of these laws might not be sustained, because I think the court has not recognized how misinformation is affecting people's ability to make decisions in elections. And then even worse than that, you have someone like Justice Thomas, who is otherwise a libertarian on speech, suggesting gratuitously in a concurring opinion in a case, Knight First Amendment Institute versus Biden, that social media companies could be required by law to carry the speech of politicians that they dislike, even if those politicians are potentially calling for violence or consistently undermining the integrity of the elections. And it was very surprising to me to see someone like Justice Thomas, who doesn't agree with the fairness doctrine, doesn't believe you can tell TV stations or newspapers what they can broadcast, that would support a law that would impose these kinds of must-carry requirements on social media companies.
Well, I want to get back to Justice Thomas's concurrence, because I also think it is extremely interesting. But I wanted to remind the audience that you can submit questions both on YouTube and on the Facebook stream. And in about 10 minutes, I'm going to open up. I'm going to start asking some audience questions. But okay, so to go back to Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, that's a really interesting concurrence, I think, for the reasons you point out, but for two other reasons. One of which is that one of the things Thomas suggests in that opinion, and then in a more recent opinion, or two more recent opinions actually, in which he calls into question whether New York Times v. Sullivan or the existing libel laws should stay in effect, or whether they should, whether libel laws should be, the First Amendment constraints on the use of libel should be significantly relaxed. In Thomas's view, that is what should happen. In all those opinions, he's actually betraying, I think, pronounced concern about the same things you're talking about in your book, which is the pervasive, what does he call the pervasiveness of falsehoods in American society. And in part, it's because he's worried about this that he wants to alter the existing First Amendment rules. But Justice Thomas's response, I think, to the same problems you are identifying in your book is, as you note, to limit the discretion of the private social media platforms, because he thinks that they're bad actors. They're favoring certain views and certain voices and harming others. And so I think the claim for must carry rules or common carrier rules is, well, at least then we'd have an even playing field. But you think that this is a terrible idea, the kind of common carrier regulations that Thomas suggests. I mean, what do we there's so much suspicion of the platforms. And moving to the second part of your book, you argue that, the platforms need to do a better job of regulating speech and disinformation. But we've seen over the past 10 years, I think, especially the past 5 years, pervasive, pronounced skepticism, I think well-justified skepticism, both by politicians and members of the American public about the good intentions of corporate actors like Facebook. So, and Justice Thomas certainly shares that view. So how do we think about corporate power in this sphere?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'd say, it's a little ironic that it's Justice Thomas saying this when just before we got on the air, news broke that his spouse, Jeannie Thomas, was sharing QAnon-type conspiracies with the chief of staff of Donald Trump to try to get interference with the vice president presiding over and allowing for the counting of the Electoral College votes. So here is someone very close to Justice Thomas who seems to be embracing these same kinds of electoral falsehoods. So yeah, we have these same concerns, but what do we do about it? And the reason I don't believe that the common carrier argument, which Professor Volokh has also at least tentatively advanced, why I don't believe that is a strong argument is it says that social media companies are more like telephone companies. So Verizon can't say, I don't like your political point of view, I'm not going to give you phone service, than like TV stations or newspapers. But I think they're much more like TV stations or newspapers. If you think about, for example, what social media platforms do, they're curating content all the time. If they didn't, our feeds would be filled with hate speech. It would be filled with misogyny. It would be filled with pornography. Platforms, whether they're considered under Section 230, which is another issue, as publishers or not, they're curating content. They decide what to include, exclude, promote, and demote. And I don't think we should have a different rule for newspapers or for Fox News or for the New York Times than we do for Facebook or for Twitter. And I think, people might object to the companies and think that they're not doing a good job in terms of filtering that speech. And the solution, as you said, that I suggest at the end of the book, is public pressure on these platforms. And if that fails, rather than having an even-handedness requirement or some kind of speech code, which in the past conservatives have been very opposed to, it's very interesting that they're embracing them now. I think the solution then is antitrust. It's to say a company like Meta maybe shouldn't own Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, and that we want to have a more divergence. I'm actually more worried about Google because its dominance in search is much greater than Facebook's dominance in social media. These are real concerns, and having just a few companies having lots of control over information is problematic, but it's not the same kind of natural scarcity that we thought we had in the 1950s when it came to television stations. And I think we can treat that somewhat differently.
Okay, but that's very interesting because, again, the analogy to the broadcasters or to the television companies makes me wonder how specific are any of the problems you're talking about to social media platforms. So if we're thinking about breaking up, should we break up? Is it Meta that we should break up, or is it the Murdoch empire we should break up? Is there something specific about the social media platforms that should lead to special regulatory solutions? Or is it that, as you suggested earlier, in many of these cases, what has happened is that the social media platforms are subject to lesser regulation than applies to other media producers, and we just want to get them to an even scale. So what we're trying to do is we're just going to apply the same rules that already apply to the cable companies and the television broadcasters and the social media platforms, or do we need there to be different rules?
I think as of now, I'm calling for parity because I do believe that social media companies are like newspapers and television stations in the sense that they carry different content, they curate that content, and they are private actors. As recently as, I think it was 2 years ago in the Halleck case, the Supreme Court saw I think it was even a public access cable station as having the right to include or exclude content. Once you go down the road of having a government regulator decide what's even-handed or what content has to be carried. Just imagine the president that you dislike the most, and this president gets to appoint the speech czar, and then I think we're in some trouble. And so that's why I favor solutions that are not, except with these very narrow points like laws regulating when, where, and how people vote, that really the solution is not less speech, but trying to give voters better tools for making intelligent decisions in this information environment.
And, the solution that we've historically applied, this non-regulatory sort of private solution that has historically applied to the newspapers and to television companies, has been to prevent profuse diffusion of falsehood, is professional standards, journalism standards. That has been historically, I think, one of the most important tools that have been used to limit what is disseminated in the public sphere and to try and maintain, I guess we could call it the truth-based nature of public discourse. Do you think that we can apply professional standards to the social media platforms? I mean, if we're thinking about parity, how would that work in this context?
Well, so one of the things I talk about in the book, and I think you're exactly right, that we rely upon journalistic norms to help us figure out the truth. And so one of the things I suggest is that there should be journalistic associations that come up with a criteria for what counts as legitimate journalism. These journalistic norms, things like, did you verify your information with at least 2 sources? Did you give the person or entity you're writing about a chance to respond? You come up with your list. And then once you have that list, you decide which newspaper, and this is all being done privately, not by a government body. This journalistic entity would decide, trade organization would decide who gets the seal of approval. And then that seal of approval could appear on social media platforms. They can piggyback on it. So rather than having a fact check of specific things, they could say, all right, does the Chicago Tribune get the seal of approval? And then voters can use that as a signal to know that it may not be that everything's going to be right because everyone makes mistakes, but at least it's an attempt in good faith to try to figure out what the truth is. So I think social media platforms can partner with these journalistic organizations to figure out what counts as reliable content. And there was this moment, this kind of funny moment around the time of January 6th, when Facebook changed the feed that people were getting. So rather than getting the most vitriolic speech and full of disinformation, they had kind of a nicer, better Facebook that gave people a lot of NPR and USA Today and things that are much more in the middle that are accepted as true. And some of the Facebook employees asked if that could be kept as the algorithm, and they were told no. But you certainly could imagine that if voters could opt into such a feed, and it would be easy to figure out what it is, that could be a tool to at least help some people figure out what is reliable information and what's not.
And in your view, could the government mandate that option?
I don't think so. I do, because I think then we would, then the government will be deciding what speech it is that we should hear and not hear. And I don't know, we could talk about a compelling interest, but it seems very hard to know that how you could have narrow tailoring to create such a system that would, provide voters only with the truth. It seems like it would be not so narrowly tailored. And more importantly, I think it would give too much discretion to the hands of either the court or the government bureaucrat that would decide whether or not these norms were being upheld, either by the journalistic society that would be coming up with the standards or by the platforms that would decide whether or not to apply it. So I don't think we can have that kind of regulation, but I do think that organizing for public pressure on the companies to do the right thing, as we've seen a lot of that happening in the last few years, that can help. Boycotts can help. These are all forms of us as people trying to have some say over what kind of content is being presented to us.
Okay, and then what about public funding for good journalism? So in the book, you suggest that one of the real problems that the current cheap speech era has produced is a tremendous decline in a real threat to the economic model of newspapers. And that this needs to be addressed by funding for newspapers. But I was I guess surprised to see that you think that most of this funding is going to come from private, or will come from private sources rather than from the government. What about government subsidies?
So I think government subsidies in theory could work. The problem is in our polarized era, it's going to be very hard to figure out who would get the subsidies and what the standards would be. It's kind of the flip side of what you just asked me about journalistic standards, because certainly we wouldn't want to fund news outfits that are deliberately spreading disinformation. So, what are the standards going to be? And so rather than having the government involved in it, I think we need to rely upon private funding, the model of something like the Texas Tribune or the Nevada Independent, ProPublica, which is also a nonprofit newsroom that is partnering with 20 different local news organizations. I think this is the wave of the future, and it's not ideal. I think, if we could have fair standards, we could have subsidies, and I'm not opposed to subsidies if we could find a way to make it workable. But I do think it is, in this era, I mean, just having watched the hearings for Judge Jackson, her confirmation hearings, and the kind of demagoguery that we've seen, I'm just very concerned that we could not reach a place where we could come up with what those standards would be, even for subsidies of news organizations.
Yes, but doesn't that throw cold water on all of the regulatory solutions that you've suggested? I mean, there is this real difficulty, I think, being a law professor in the current era. What kinds of laws can Congress plausibly enact?
Right. So, right. So that this is true about, you'd think, everything, but there is a moment now where there is a desire to do something about the big tech and the social media companies. Is there a place to come together on things that could unite both sides? Now, 10, 15 years ago, I think we might have said improved disclosure, because back then there were still campaign finance limits, and people like Senator McConnell were saying no limits, full disclosure. Now they've kind of moved the goalpost as the Supreme Court has been eliminating campaign finance limits. So it is true that these solutions, the law solutions, may have to come at a later time, which is why the last part of my book says, I assume most of these things are not going to be passed, and if they are passed, that the Supreme Court could strike a number of them down under what I consider to be an incorrect reading of the First Amendment. So what else can we do? And so it's things like pressuring the platforms to do the right thing in terms of deplatforming, which is something we can talk about, or this journalistic seal of approval, as well as increased media literacy, which is commonly called for. None of these things require Congress to do anything. And in this environment, I think that's the safest bet.
Okay, well, talking about deplatforming, I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions now. So one of the questions we got was, what's the legality of deplatforming? Elaborating on that a little bit more, you might say, what should the rules be when it comes to the decisions platform make to deplatform users?
Right. So just to give a little bit of the history here, after the January 6th insurrection, both Twitter and Facebook decided to remove Donald Trump from their platforms. So his posts no longer appear. Both companies did so as a permanent ban. Facebook then turned the issue over to its self-created oversight board, which is kind of like Supreme Court of Facebook that is not quite binding on what Facebook does. And this group came back and said to Facebook, you've got to tell us what the criteria are for deplatforming, and you've got to impose a term and say how long it lasts for. And so Facebook responded by saying it's going to be a 2-year term, and the standard for whether or not Donald Trump should be restored is whether he's still a threat to American democracy by continuing to undermine the legitimacy of the election. And what I argue, and I argued at the time that the Facebook Oversight Board was adjudicating this question for Facebook, was this was in a letter with a number of my colleagues, that the standard should be a very high bar. It should be very difficult for a politician to do something so bad that they get deplatformed, because we do want to have very good, rigorous discussion of issues. We don't want to have a very narrow discussion in the context of elections. And yet, when someone is consistently undermining the integrity of elections for no reason, there's no reason to think that the 2020 election was stolen. And this is having very damaging effects on our democracy. There's no reason to call people for a wild time to come to try to interfere with the valid counting of electoral college votes. I think Donald Trump crossed that line, easily crossed that line. It was the right thing to do to deplatform him. And I don't think Facebook should restore him, because we know he's still putting out statements. They're sometimes on Twitter through his screenshot, through his spokesperson, I think he is still a danger to American democracy, and he should not be put back on. In terms of the legality of doing so, unless these laws that have been passed in Texas and Florida are found to be constitutional, right now they're preliminarily enjoined by the federal courts, then I do think that deplatforming is fine. And it is consistent with, as we talked about earlier, the First Amendment in terms of treating these as private companies that are making editorial decisions, much like the editorial decisions that newspapers or others make.
But should the social media platforms have total discretion to make these decisions? I mean, you're saying in the Trump case, it was justified because of his tweets. But in other cases, we might disagree with that decision. You might think it's not justified. So who gets to decide, or who should get to decide, ideally?
Well, again, I think these companies should, just like MSNBC or Fox News decides if they're going to put Donald Trump on the air. I really think it's the same kind of question. And if we think that the media company or the social media company has too much power, then we have to look to antitrust rather than speech controls as the way of trying to deal with that kind of problem.
Yeah, although antitrust has its own problems because, I mean, so for example, to think about the Trump deplatforming, what we saw, it was, I think really remarkable. There had been months and months of complaints to Facebook and Twitter and YouTube about the speech that Trump was putting out on all of these platforms. And it was only after the January 6th invasion of the Capitol that the platforms took action, but they all took action within something like a 24-hour period. They all reached the same decision. Amazingly enough, their editorial standards all appear to be exactly the same, but at along the whole sequence of events. So that leads me to worry that there's going to be a lot of coordinated activity, that platforms may not, in fact, disagree that much with one another. And so even if we break up the platforms, might we not have still the same problem that platforms are making decisions that are bad for American democracy?
Yeah, maybe so. One bad decision I talk about is Facebook and Twitter decided to remove posts that the New York Post had put up about reports related to Hunter Biden's laptop. And I think they were both, Twitter and Facebook were both quite gun shy about the way that Russian media was able to, the way the Russian government was able to manipulate media in the 2016 election to hurt Hillary Clinton with leaking of damaging documents. And so, yeah, I think there's a herd mentality problem. There's a learning curve that's associated with this. I do think as there are more companies, they're probably going to try different strategies. So some platforms might be more Trump friendly and they would include the content, and others would not. And so it would be kind of a question of what kind of pressure the public, and I should mention this as well as I talk about in cheap speech, the employees of the companies can bring to bear on these companies to do the right thing.
Okay, I'll turn to another audience question, which is, how does cable news deal with this predicament? The predicament, I take it to be the problem of lies and misinformation.
Well, so cable news is a kind of mediator. So unlike social media, where a post from, say, a Donald Trump will appear without any context, except for this, this poor labeling that we talked about a little earlier. Cable news will generally put a quote in context. They won't simply be like C-SPAN and run a politician's speech from beginning to end without any commentary. But of course, and we talked about this a bit earlier, some cable stations no longer abide by abide by journalistic norms. And so they're willing to allow false claims to go on and be unrebutted. One answer to that has been, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is the use of defamation law. And so when the cable companies like OAN or Newsmax or Fox News were repeating false statements that the voting machines were being hacked and that they were not reliable, they were sued by the voting machine companies. And I do support the continued use of the actual malice standard. I think we do need to have breathing room and allow people to criticize government officials without fear of being sued. But when someone crosses the line and they know that what they're producing is false, then there could be consequences under defamation law. And that is a way that law could help to deal with falsehoods in the cable context.
What about defamation law as applied to the social media platforms? An audience member asked, do slander and libel laws apply to false speech on social media? And also we might think, should they apply?
Right. So and you are probably more of the expert on this generally. I don't say you certainly are more of an expert on this generally. So maybe you should answer this question. But so far as I understand it, and I'm not a Section 230 expert, the person who posts the libelous statement, someone who writes that, could be sued for libel. But the social media platform is given some immunity through a federal statute called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I mean, that's a whole huge topic unto itself. I think that, there was a moment, and I talk about this in Cheap Speech, where Donald Trump vetoed a defense bill, a must-pass bill, in order to try to force platforms to get rid of, force Congress, to get rid of Section 230. I actually think that would have led to more of Trump's speech being removed, because then the platforms would have worried that some of the things he was saying that could potentially be defamatory could subject them to liability. And so I wasn't quite clear why it was that Donald Trump was trying to get rid of Section 230, because it would actually make there be less speech. I mean, it's a comparison to how free the press is in the United States compared to Britain, where their libel and defamation laws are much stricter, and it's much easier to sue news media for what they do. I think we'd be moving in that same direction if we started allowing social media companies to be sued for the content, as we do today when newspapers publish, say, an op-ed that potentially contains defamatory information.
And what about hate speech? I mean, we've been talking a lot about false speech, lies, misinformation, disinformation. But surely the phenomenon of cheap speech that you identify in the book also produces a lot of cheap hate speech. So how should we think about that? What should the platforms or the government do about that? So
here I will just say that that's beyond the purview of my project. There are lots of damaging kinds of speech. Another is the posting of non-consensual sexual imagery, so-called revenge porn. There are all kinds of problems that cheap speech raises, but I'm focused primarily on, or exclusively on, the question of how this affects our elections and our democracy, and in terms of the democratic process, in terms of voting. Messages, the closest thing I talk about in the book to this question is messages that demobilize voters, messages that say, don't bother voting, or saying things that are not necessarily lies, but are intended to suppress turnout. There are some people who argue that that should be regulated, and there should be laws against that. Again, I worry about the government regulator, who I'm not going to like. Sometimes it's going to be from the president of the party that you don't like. Do you really trust that government regulator to be able to decide what is suppressive and what needs to be removed from the platform? So I think there, again, we can pressure the platforms to remove hateful speech that tends to demobilize voters, but I don't think we want to have a law about it.
Although we do have federal and state voter suppression laws that could be extended to this context, but you think that would be too dangerous?
Well, so the question is whether those laws can be extended to pure speech, right? So if you stand with a gun outside of a polling place, that kind of voter intimidation is illegal under federal law and under state law. But if you tell people, don't bother voting because your vote's not going to make a difference, and you direct those messages at people of in a particular area because you have an idea of how they're going to vote, I think then you're really getting into the core of First Amendment protected speech. And voter suppression is not a term that is easily defined, and it's easy to imagine a kind of vagueness problem that would arise if you gave a government regulator the ability to define that term and decide who gets to be charged with violating such a law.
Okay, another audience question. How does free speech apply to foreign actors and bots? I guess, how does the First Amendment apply to foreign actors and bots?
So in the context of elections, the Supreme Court has said that foreign actors can be barred from making campaign contributions to candidates, and they can be barred from spending on express advocacy that calls for the election or defeat of a candidate. I mentioned earlier this Blumen case, which was a summary affirmance of the Supreme Court. They didn't issue their own opinion. They just agreed with the lower court. But this is worth emphasizing for a moment. That lower court opinion was written by then Judge, now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And in that opinion, Judge Kavanaugh construed this bar on foreign actors spending money elections to apply only to express advocacy and not to issue advocacy. And if that's true, it would be a very porous kind of law, because we know from our earlier experience in the beginning of the 21st century that when you ban express advocacy spending by corporations, but you allow them to engage in issue ads, they just shift to ads that say, Joe Biden is a true leader, or call Bob Dole and tell him what you think of his lousy Medicare plan, something like that. And so it's an unclear question, and I discussed this in Cheap Speech, whether or not a ban on foreign spending in elections could extend to issue advocacy. And if it does, are we going to have a media exception? So suppose that the Guardian newspaper, which is based in Britain, and they target Americans for subscriptions. Suppose they run an editorial and then they want to pay Facebook to run ads saying, read our editorial as to why you should vote for this candidate for president. There's a question about whether that activity would be barred under the foreign ban, or whether there has to be a built-in media exemption. And most recently, the Supreme Court has been quite skeptical of treating media companies more favorably when it comes to issues of campaign expenditures. We saw that in the Citizens United case, when the court would no longer differentiate media corporations from other corporations.
And why write special rules for foreign entities, particularly if they're going to raise these problems? Because, I think in the 2016 election, one of the major fears was Russian interference in the election. But by 2020, I think there was widespread recognition that many of the lies were domestically grown. They were right here in the USA. And so this question about foreign speech didn't seem as salient. So do we need to regulate foreign speech differently?
Right. So I don't claim in the book that foreign spending to try to influence elections is necessarily going to have more misinformation and disinformation in it. Much of the information that the Russian government was spreading was truthful information, or it was opinions. Saying don't vote for Hillary Clinton is not misinformation, right? What they were misrepresenting was the identity of who they were as speakers. I think, and this is consistent with what then Judge Kavanaugh said in the Blumen case, it's an interest in democratic self-government. It's the idea that when we're deciding to hold an election, the people who should participate in the discussion about who should be elected and why are the people who are part of the body of those who are going to be conducting the election. And so the Supreme Court's precedents on foreign speech generally are quite complex. But I do think that in this, in the particular context of spending on elections, the court has said that, the court has at least accepted the conclusion that Judge Kavanaugh put forward, that the interest in self-government justifies laws that limit domestic actors to being the ones to try to influence our fellow voters in terms of how to vote.
All right, and I'd like to ask you just one last question, which is, what's one thing you'd like audience members to walk away thinking about or knowing tonight?
So the one thing I want voters to recognize is that in this current era of cheap speech, where misinformation flows freely and disinformation is up there with truthful information, we need to devise tools that are consistent with the First Amendment to protect our democracy and to protect robust political speech.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to the audience for all your questions. I wish we had time to answer them all, but the hour is up. I'm Genevieve Lakier, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School, and I want to thank Rick Hasen, Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine School of Law, and author of the new book, Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It, for today's event. This was a really fun conversation. I'm glad we got to do it. Thank you all for coming and supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. Good night.
Thank you.